Before we get into this, if you've been following this series from the beginning, you already know this story hits differently than most history. If you're new here, subscribe now and go back to episode 1. You're going to want the full picture for what's about to happen. Like the video if you're staying. Let's get into it. The night before the battle, both armies made camp within sight of each other. Tacitus records that Suetonius spent that night doing what Roman commanders did before decisive engagements, walking the line, speaking to his officers, examining the ground one final time. The valley he had chosen was narrow at the Roman end and widened toward the open plain. Forest rose on both sides. The terrain would funnel Boudica's army into a compressing front as they advanced, turning their greatest advantage, their numbers, into a geometric problem they couldn't solve. He had done everything a general could do. The outcome was still not certain. In the British camp, Tacitus tells us the families had come. Warriors, wives, children, elderly parents. People who had followed this army from the beginning and wanted to see the final victory with their own eyes. They had arranged their wagons in a great arc behind the army lines, some of them sitting up to see better over the heads of the warriors in front. It seemed like a reasonable place to watch history being made. It was the decision that would unmake them. In her chariot, Boudica moved through her people one last time. Tacitus describes it with the detail of someone reporting an eyewitness account. She rode from tribe to tribe, her daughters before her, her voice carrying across the assembled thousands. She wasn't performing. She wasn't reciting a speech written by an advisor. She was saying what she meant, to people who had every reason in the world to believe her. "I am not here as a queen fighting for wealth and a kingdom," she told them, her voice cutting through the pre-dawn quiet. "I am here as an ordinary person, fighting for my freedom, for the body that Rome violated, for my daughters." She looked at the Roman line across the valley. "The gods are with us. They have given us 1 battle and 3 victories already. On this field today we will win or we will die. That is what I intend. The men can live as slaves if they choose." Her voice dropped for just a moment. "I will not." The roar that answered her rolled across the valley and hit the Roman line like a physical force. On the Roman side, Suetonius was doing something different. He wasn't inspiring his soldiers. He was instructing them. Tacitus, whose father-in-law Agricola was on Suetonius's staff that morning as a young tribune, records the speech in the practical, almost clinical register of a man who understood that what his soldiers needed now was not fire but precision. "Ignore the noise," Suetonius told them, walking the line. "There are more women than fighting men in that army. They are poorly equipped. We have beaten them before." A centurion near the front kept his eyes on the approaching mass across the valley. Tens of thousands. Still more arriving at the edges. "Sir," he began. "I know what you're counting," Suetonius said without breaking his stride. "Count our ground instead. Count our formation. Count the distance between you and the man beside you and make sure it stays exactly that distance when they come." He reached the end of the line and turned back. "Hold the javelins until they are close. Then throw. Push forward with the shields. Short swords in the gaps. Stay in formation and we win. Break formation and we die." He paused. "Don't break formation." It was, by the standards of Roman military oratory, almost insultingly simple. But the soldiers understood exactly what was being asked of them and why. They had been in the field long enough to know that Suetonius's tactical judgment was the only reason they were still alive. They checked their equipment. They waited. Boudica's army advanced. Tacitus's account is detailed enough that military historians have been able to reconstruct the sequence with reasonable confidence. The British charge was massive. The sound of it, the war horns and the shouting and the ground vibrating under 100,000 feet, was something the Roman soldiers felt in their chests before they heard it properly. The Roman line held its position. This was the first test. Not of physical courage but of discipline. The instinct when something that large is moving toward you at speed is to either charge to meet it or step back. Suetonius had trained his men to do neither. To stand exactly where they were, javelins ready, and wait for the range he wanted. They waited. The British front line hit the narrowing part of the valley and began, imperceptibly at first, to compress. Warriors who had been running with room on either side found themselves pressing against their neighbors. The front of the charge was still fast, still formidable, but the sides were beginning to feel the walls of the defile. Suetonius gave the order. The pilaf flew in overlapping waves, the Roman javelin, specifically engineered to penetrate shields and bend on impact so it couldn't be retrieved and thrown back. The front lines of the British charge went down. Shields became anchors, the bent iron shanks dragging them downward at the exact moment warriors needed their arms free. The Roman line moved forward. Not running. Marching, in the tight wedge formation that Roman infantry had been perfecting for 3 centuries. Shields overlapping. Short swords working in the spaces between bodies. The British longsword needed room to swing. In the compression of the defile, that room was gone. Push, Suetonius called from behind the line. Push and hold. The wedge went deeper. The cavalry came around the flanks. And somewhere in the compressed, struggling center of Boudica's army, the terrible arithmetic of the terrain became undeniable. The retreat began at the edges first, then the center. What had been an army became a crowd. What had been a charge became a compression. And behind all of it, the wagons. The families who had come to watch the triumph were now directly in the path of tens of thousands of people trying to survive. The wagons couldn't move. Too many of them, packed too tightly, the animals panicking in the noise and the press of bodies. Tacitus records this detail with the sparse precision of someone describing a mechanical failure. The wagons blocked the retreat. The warriors who had broken and were running found themselves running into a wall of wood and panic, and people who had no idea this was happening until it was already on top of them. The Roman cavalry cut through the flanks. The Roman infantry kept advancing. Cassius Dio records the casualty figures: 80,000 Britons dead. Tacitus puts Roman losses at around 400 killed. Historians have questioned those numbers for centuries. The ratio is extraordinary. But the terrain, the formation, the blocked retreat, the mechanics of what Suetonius had engineered, make the asymmetry less impossible than it first appears. This was not two equal forces meeting on open ground. This was a trap built over weeks of deliberate retreat, and it had worked with a completeness that even Suetonius could not have entirely predicted. The battle is over. But the story isn't. What happened to Boudica in the hours after this field, and what Rome did next, is the part of this story that history has never quite agreed on. If you want to know how it ends, subscribe and hit the like button. The final episode of this series is coming, and it's the one that explains why her statue stands outside Parliament today. In the city she burned. Boudica survived the battle. Both Tacitus and Cassius Dio agree on this. She was not killed on the field. What happened after is where the two sources diverge, and the divergence itself tells you something about how history works. About how the same person, viewed through different lenses and different centuries, becomes different things. Tacitus says she took poison. That faced with capture, with what Rome had already shown it was willing to do to her, with the memory of what had happened after Prasutagus died still entirely present in her body, she chose death on her own terms. No Roman triumph. No cage. No demonstration of imperial power over the woman who had come closest to ending its British province. She had controlled what she could control from the moment Prasutagus died. She chose to control this too. Cassius Dio says she fell ill and died shortly after the battle. Exhaustion perhaps. The physical and psychological weight of everything finally claiming what the Roman army had not managed to take. We don't know which account is accurate. We don't know where she died or where she was buried. There are legends that she lies somewhere under London or in Norfolk, or that her ashes were scattered across the land she had fought for, but none are verifiable. All of them say something true about what she had become to the people who kept telling her story long after Rome stopped writing it down. What Tacitus records with flat certainty is this: she was not captured. She was not paraded through Rome. She denied them that. She was, to the last, herself. Poenius Postumus, the camp prefect of the 2nd Legion who had refused Suetonius's direct order to march, heard the news of the victory. He fell on his sword. Tacitus records it in a single sentence, without comment, as if the act required no elaboration. He had denied his men their share of the glory. He knew what that meant under the code he had failed to live by. Suetonius began the reprisals. Villages burned. Leaders executed. Land seized. The Iceni and Trinovants were to be made an example. It nearly provoked a second uprising. The new procurator, Gaius Julius Classicianus, sent a private report to Nero. His assessment was precise. Suetonius's reprisals were so extreme they risked destabilizing the province permanently. The people had nothing left to lose. Rome needed a governor who could rebuild, not a general still fighting a war that was already won. Nero sent an imperial freedman to assess the situation. The freedman found that Suetonius was right about the battle and Classicianus was right about everything else. Suetonius was recalled on a pretext. The real reason was what Classicianus had written. The new governor took the moderate approach. The province quieted. Britain remained Roman for another 350 years, shaped at every turn by the memory of what had almost happened. By the knowledge that this island had people capable, under the right circumstances, of making the most powerful empire in the world genuinely afraid. Boudica had proven that. In ash and blood and a layer of burned debris still sitting under 3 English cities today. 10,000 soldiers. That's all he had. On one side of a narrow valley in ancient Britain, Gaius Suetonius Paulinus stood with 10,000 men and looked at what was coming toward him across the open plain. He had chosen this ground carefully, a defile with forest at his back, open terrain ahead, the kind of geography that a lifetime of military command had taught him to find and use before the enemy could take it from him. What was coming toward him was not 10,000. Not 50,000. Tacitus, who had access to men who actually stood on that field, puts the number at something so large that if they had lined up in a single rank, they would have extended beyond the entire British battle line. Suetonius looked at that and didn't move. What happened in the next few hours would determine whether Rome kept Britain or lost it forever. Whether 30 years of occupation ended in complete, humiliating defeat. Whether the woman in the chariot at the front of that army, the woman Rome had flogged, whose daughters Rome had violated, who had risen from that dirt and built the largest British fighting force in history, would achieve the most improbable military victory of the ancient world. This is the story of the last field.